Hello, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Rain poured down on Fifth Avenue like a flood, icy droplets pounding the pavement and blending with the flickering neon lights of the city signs. The blaring horns, footsteps, and chatter formed a chaotic symphony of New York at dusk. But in the narrow alley behind St. Augustine's Church, the noise seemed to vanish, muffled by the gentle, broken sobs of a girl. Savannah Blake sat curled on the wet stone ground, her once elegant white silk wedding gown now stained with mud and rain. Her bare feet trembled, toes curling from the cold. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, mixing with her tears, leaving dark marks like wounds that would never heal. She hugged herself tightly, as if letting go would cause her entire being to fall apart. Her veil, the one pinned to her hair that morning by a renowned designer, now lay crumpled in a dirty puddle. Savannah couldn't stop replaying the moment inside the church just hours earlier. St. Augustine's, with its vibrant stained glass windows and echoing choir, had been set for her grand wedding. Today she was supposed to marry Ethan Caldwell, the heir of a powerful dynasty, the man her father, Richard Blake, called the key to the company's future. But Ethan never showed. No explanation. No message, just silence, cold and cruel, like a blade through her heart. She could still feel the eyes of over 200 guests, wealthy, powerful people with practiced smiles, watching her as time passed and no groom arrived. Left at the altar, someone whispered, their voice sharp as glass. What a disgrace to the Blakes. Savannah had stood there, shaking, holding a bouquet of white carnations, the heavy weight of the gown suffocating her, as the world seemed to mock her. She wanted to scream, to tell everyone this wasn't her fault, that she had never even wanted this marriage. But she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, and she just stood there, frozen, like a doll abandoned on stage. In the waiting room afterward, her mother, Eleanor Blake, had screamed at her, voice icy and cutting. "You've shamed this family. You couldn't even keep a man." Her father's face burned red with fury. He said only one thing. "I invested everything in you, and this is what I get." Their words struck her like sledgehammers to the chest. She had wanted to explain that Ethan never loved her, that the marriage was just a deal between families, that she had begged to call it off, but no one listened. But her parents didn't care. To them, she was just a product returned, a stain on the family name. So she ran, no shoes, no phone, no idea where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. From the church, from the pitying eyes, from the golden cage her family had locked her in since she was a child. She ran until her bare feet bled, until she stumbled into this alley, where no one noticed a bride left behind. Rain soaked her gown, chilled her to the bone, but she didn't care. She just wanted to disappear. "What did I do wrong?" Savannah whispered, her voice breaking. "Why doesn't anyone want me?" She bowed her head, tangled blonde hair plastered to her forehead. Tears fell freely, mixing with the rain, as if the world itself cried with her. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps or notice the figure standing in front of her until a deep voice broke through the storm. "Are you all right?" Savannah startled and looked up. Through swollen red eyes, she saw a tall man in a dark red flannel shirt and faded jeans. He wore an old cowboy hat, rain running down the brim. His face was partly shadowed, but his deep brown eyes seemed to look straight into her soul. Without waiting for a reply, he shrugged off a heavy rain-soaked leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You'll catch cold," he said evenly, as if finding a crying bride in an alley was nothing out of the ordinary. Savannah wanted to say something, but her throat tightened. She just stared at him, stunned, as he sat down beside her, right there on the wet stone. He didn't touch her, didn't ask questions. He just sat, shoulder to shoulder like an old friend. His scent, earth, dry grass, pine, drifted toward her, strange but comforting. For a moment, the rain didn't feel so cold. Savannah began, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what I'm doing here." He turned to her, his eyes gentle. "Sometimes you don't need to know what you're doing. Just knowing you're still breathing is enough." The words were simple, but they hit something deep inside her. She looked down at her trembling hands now wrapped in his coat. She didn't know who he was, but there was something in his voice, in the way he sat beside her without judgment, that made her feel safe. "I'm Savannah," she whispered. He nodded. "Elijah." No questions, no pity, just silence and the sound of rain. Savannah closed her eyes, letting the warmth from his coat seep into her skin. She didn't even realize she had leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, until she felt the solid strength of him. And then, Elijah wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close. That embrace was strong, warm, like it was saying that even if the world was falling apart, there was still a place for her to rest. Savannah didn't cry anymore. She just sat there, in the arms of a stranger, feeling his steady breathing sync with her shattered heartbeat. The rain was still falling, but the sound of it was drowned out by the rich aroma of roasted coffee and the quiet murmur of customers inside a small cafe on 47th Street. Savannah sat huddled in the corner, Elijah's leather jacket wrapped around her shoulders, heavy but warm. Her filthy white silk wedding dress clung to her skin, every fold a reminder of the disaster from just hours ago. She gripped the hot coffee Elijah had ordered for her, its warmth seeping into her freezing fingers, though it couldn't quite chase away the shivers in her chest. Elijah sat across from her, silent, his large hands resting on the table, holding a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained on the window, where raindrops streamed down the glass. His silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was space, quiet space that let her breathe, allowed her to shrink without judgment. Savannah didn't know why she had followed him, why she was still sitting there, but something about his presence, solid, unassuming, made her stay. She looked down into the cup, the dark surface reflecting her swollen, red-rimmed eyes. That image pulled her back to the moment in St. Augustine's Church, when she'd stood in the center of the red-carpeted aisle, bouquet in hand, and realized Ethan wasn't coming. The whispers of the guests still echoed in her mind, sharp as shattered glass. The bride got left. The Blakes must be losing it. Did she really think she was good enough for the Caldwells? Those weren't just whispers. They were blades, slicing through an already fragile sense of self-worth. Savannah had never wanted to marry Ethan. The marriage had been arranged by her parents, part of a financial merger between two powerful empires. Ethan Caldwell, with his perfect smile and cold eyes, had been the ideal choice in her father's view. "You'll secure this family's future," Richard Blake had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She had nodded, like she always did, because from the time she was little, she'd learned that resistance only led to pain. She gave up her dream of painting, gave up quiet mornings with brushes and color to become the version of herself her family wanted. Obedient, polished, a pawn in their power game. But today, when Ethan didn't show, when her mother screamed that she was a disgrace to the family, when her father turned away without even a glance, Savannah realized none of her efforts had ever mattered. She had run. No shoes, no phone, no destination, just the instinct to survive, to escape the cage she'd been locked inside for too long. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," Elijah said, pulling her from her thoughts. He was still looking out the window, but she felt his attention on her, as if he were waiting, but never pressing. Savannah clenched the coffee cup, her nails digging into her palm. "Today was supposed to be my wedding day," she said, her voice hoarse, so weak she barely recognized it. "But the groom, he didn't show. I stood there in front of hundreds of people, and he never came." Elijah turned to look at her, his deep brown eyes showing neither surprise nor pity. He simply nodded. "So that's why you were in that alley, in the rain." She let out a dry, cracked laugh, more like a sob. "Sounds pathetic, doesn't it? The runaway bride bolting from her own wedding, no clue where to go, no idea what to do." "Not pathetic," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Just human. Everyone needs to run sometimes." His words made her pause. She looked at him, trying to find some trace of a lie, some hollow reassurance. But there was none. Only sincerity and a quiet sadness, like maybe he too had once run from something. Savannah lowered her head, wet blonde hair sticking to her cheek. "I didn't love him," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would lessen the pain. The marriage was arranged by my parents. They said it was my duty, the way to protect the family. I did everything they asked, but today, my mother called me a disgrace. My father wouldn't even look at me. And the people in the church, they laughed, they whispered, like I was some joke. She paused, throat tightening. The memories, pitying eyes, mocking laughter, her parents' cold silence, rushed over her like a wave, threatening to drown her. I tried to become what they wanted, she continued, her voice shaking. I gave up everything, my dreams, myself, just to make them proud. But now I have nothing. No family, no future, not even myself. The words poured out like a dam breaking, and with them came the tears she had held back. She covered her face, her shoulders trembling, trying to stifle her sobs. She didn't want to cry in front of a stranger, didn't want to seem any weaker than she already felt. But she couldn't stop. All of it, the humiliation, the pain, the loneliness, crashed inside her, and she felt like she was disappearing. Elijah said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, rough and calloused, but warm, steady. The touch was gentle, not invasive, but enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Savannah leaned forward, resting her head on the table, letting her tears fall, letting the heat from his hand seep through the layers of pain. She didn't understand why his presence was comforting, but right now it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't know how long had passed before the crying stopped. She sat up, wiping her face quickly, embarrassed that he'd seen her like this. I don't know where to go now, she said, her voice barely audible. I can't go home. I can't face them. Elijah looked at her, his eyes gentle, but with a glint of quiet resolve. I'm heading back to Vermont, he said. It's quieter there than it is here. If you want, you can come with me. Just for a few days until you figure out what's next. Savannah blinked. You don't know me. Why would you? He shrugged, a small smile flickering across his lips. I don't know you, but I know what it's like to have nowhere else to go. And I figured, maybe you just need a place to breathe. She looked at him, trying to find a reason to refuse, a reason to doubt, but she couldn't. There was only his eyes, steady and kind, and a strange feeling that, despite knowing him for less than an hour, she could trust him. She had nothing left to lose, nowhere else to go, and maybe, just this once, she wanted to choose something for herself. Okay, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I'll go. Elijah nodded, asking no further questions. He stood, flagged down the waiter to pay, then held the door open for her. Savannah followed him out into the rain, his jacket still draped over her shoulders, her heart still heavy. But for the first time all day, a flicker of hope stirred within her, a faint light breaking through the dark. Elijah's old pickup truck rumbled along winding roads, leaving behind the bright lights of New York and easing into the gentle darkness of rural Vermont. The steady hum of the engine, mingled with the soft patter of rain against the windshield, formed a quiet melody that felt intimate and grounding. Savannah sat in the passenger seat, Elijah's leather jacket still wrapped around her. Her filthy wedding dress had stiffened with dried rain, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She stared out the window at the moonlit fields that stretched beyond sight, and for the first time in days she felt a strange calm, like the world was finally slowing down enough for her to breathe. She hadn't said a word during the drive, and neither had Elijah. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence between them wasn't awkward or strained. It was mutual, unspoken. An agreement that she didn't owe an explanation, and he wouldn't ask for one. Savannah hugged herself, trying to block out the memories of St. Augustine's church, the murmurs of the guests, her mother's icy stare, her father's cutting silence. But whenever the weight of those memories crept in, she glanced at Elijah, his solid frame illuminated by the dim dashboard light, and somehow it anchored her, even if just a little. She didn't know what she was doing, following a stranger to a place she'd never heard of. Vermont. The name itself painted images of open fields, wooden houses, and a kind of life she'd never dared to imagine. She was afraid she was making a mistake, afraid there was no place in this world truly meant for her. But alongside that fear was something else. Small, stubborn hope. Hope that maybe, for just a few days, she could find a place to heal. A place to remember who she was before the Blakes turned her into a shadow. When the truck turned onto a gravel path, the headlights lit up a weathered wooden gate with a carved sign, Turner Farm. Elijah climbed out, opened the gate, and continued driving until they reached a modest farmhouse nestled in a meadow. The house wasn't large, but it glowed with warmth. Golden light spilling from the windows, bunches of dried lavender hanging on the porch. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear a soft whinny of horses and the whisper of wind through the trees. Elijah shut off the engine and turned to her. "We're here," he said, his voice low and calm. "You can rest in the guest room. I'll make something to eat." Savannah nodded, unsure of what to say. She stepped out, her sore bare feet pressing into cold gravel. The scent of wet grass and lavender filled her nose. Strange but comforting. She followed Elijah inside, her steps uncertain like an uninvited guest. The house was simple but welcoming. Polished wood floors, a crackling fireplace, and framed photos on the walls. Savannah paused in front of one, a young woman with a radiant smile standing beside Elijah. Something in the woman's eyes made her chest tighten, but she didn't dare ask. Elijah led her to a small room at the end of the hallway. "This is the guest room," he said, opening the door. "There are clean clothes in the closet, and the bathroom's right there. I'll leave food out when you're ready." Savannah looked at him, moved by his quiet kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. I don't know how to repay you." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just rest. We'll figure out the rest later." Then he turned and left her in the peaceful stillness. The room was small but cozy, with a single bed draped in a wool blanket, an old wooden desk, and a painting on the wall, a lavender field under a sunset sky, painted with bold, emotional strokes. Savannah stood silently before it, her fingers brushing the wooden frame. There was something in the lines and the brushwork that made her heart pound, like it was calling to a part of her she'd buried long ago. She remembered afternoons spent painting, when color and texture were the only language she needed. She remembered the freedom, the sense of being fully herself, before her father tore up her first canvas and called art a useless waste. She turned away, trying to shake off the memory. She opened the closet and found a flannel shirt and old jeans, probably belonging to the woman in the photo. She changed into them, feeling the soft fabric against her skin. And for the first time all day, she didn't feel like the bride who'd been left at the altar. She felt like a person again. She stepped into the bathroom and washed away the smeared mascara and grime from her face. The reflection in the mirror was unfamiliar. No makeup, no veil, just Savannah, with swollen eyes and faint scratches on her cheeks. When she entered the kitchen, Elijah was at the stove, stirring a pot of steaming soup. The smell of toasted bread and herbs made her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten since morning. He motioned for her to sit at the table, where he'd set out a bowl of hot soup, a slice of bread, and a glass of water. "It's no fancy dinner," he said, "but it'll warm you up." Savannah sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the spoon. She ate slowly, each bite like medicine, soothing the cold inside her body and her heart. Elijah sat across from her, sipping from an old coffee mug. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask why she ran or what had happened to the wedding dress now stuffed in a trash bag. And she didn't ask him either. Not about why he lived alone, not about the woman in the photo, not about the weight in his eyes that hinted at some untold story. Elijah carried a past that wasn't easy to forget. His wife, Grace, wasn't dead. She had left. 5 years ago, she packed her bags and walked away from the farm, chasing a life she said Vermont couldn't give her. She wanted city lights, freedom, something more than long days in fields and stables. Elijah hadn't stopped her. He let her go, believing it was what she needed, but the wound she left behind never fully healed. He buried himself in the land, in the horses, in the lavender, because it was the only way he knew how to keep going. Savannah's sudden presence, her quiet grief, stirred something in him, a loneliness he knew too well, and a fragile flicker of something more, maybe the urge to care for someone again. After the meal, Elijah led her out to the porch, where an old rocking chair and a wool blanket waited. "Sit out here for a while," he said. "The night air's nice." Savannah sat down, wrapped the blanket around her, and gazed across the field. The lavender swayed gently in the breeze, moonlight shimmering across the grass. The horses stood silently in their paddock, shadows moving under the silver light. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs, carrying the scent of earth and wet grass. For the first time all day, she felt like she could breathe without being crushed. She didn't know why, but sitting there beneath the starry sky, she felt a strange pull. She stood, went inside, and rummaged through a desk drawer until she found an old notebook and a pencil. She returned to the porch, sat down, and began to draw. The first lines were shaky, uncertain, like her hands had forgotten how. But then, like a long locked door swinging open, emotion came rushing back. She drew the lavender fields, the purple blooms bowing in the wind, the moonlight dancing on grass. She didn't think, didn't aim for perfection. She let her heart lead the way. When she stopped, the page was full of vibrant strokes. Not a perfect drawing, but a real one. Real like her heart in this moment. She stared at it, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt alive. Not just surviving, but truly alive. Elijah stepped onto the porch, holding a cup of hot tea. He set it beside her, glanced at the drawing, but said nothing. He just stood there, quiet, like a guardian in the night. Savannah looked at him, something inside her stirring. She didn't know who he was or why he was being so kind. But in this moment, surrounded by peace and silence, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place to begin again. Dawn filtered through the wooden slats of the stable, painting pale golden stripes across the dirt floor. Elijah stood beside a brown horse, his calloused hand gently stroking its mane as he whispered calming words while checking its hooves. The horse snorted softly, as if it understood the tenderness in his touch. Beyond the stable, the lavender fields stretched into the morning mist, and the wooden house stood quiet, as if waiting for the day to begin. But inside Elijah, something was stirring, something he didn't quite have a name for. It had been 3 days since he brought Savannah to the farm. 3 days, and she was still here, like an unexpected guest he didn't know how to receive. She slept in the guest room, ate the meals he cooked, and sometimes sat on the porch sketching, her drawings filled with a kind of sorrow he didn't dare ask about. He hadn't questioned her past, the wedding dress, or what she was running from. He didn't want to pressure her, didn't want to shatter the fragile quiet he saw in her eyes. But he couldn't deny that her presence had unsettled the life he'd spent years keeping simple, emotionless, since Grace had left. Grace. Even now, 5 years later, the name made his chest tighten. He remembered the day she left, her small suitcase dragging across the wooden floor, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the road beyond the ranch. "I can't live like this anymore, Elijah," she'd said, her voice cold but trembling. "I need more. I need a real life." He hadn't argued, hadn't begged. He just stood there and watched her get in the car. And when the dust settled, he knew she wouldn't come back. He didn't blame her. Maybe she was right. This life, this land, wasn't meant for everyone. But her leaving had carved a hollow inside him, a wound he covered with long days of work, the sounds of horses, and the scent of lavender. Elijah fastened the reins and led the horse out to pasture. He heard the light crunch of footsteps on gravel, and when he turned, he saw Savannah standing at the stable entrance, wearing an oversized flannel shirt and old jeans. Grace's clothes. Her blonde hair was loosely tied, a few strands falling across her cheek. She clutched a sketchbook in her arms, her eyes hesitant but curious. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said softly, as if afraid to disturb the morning peace. Elijah shook his head, a faint smile passing across his face. "Not at all. You're up early." She shrugged and walked closer, her eyes drifting to the horse. "I didn't sleep much. Thought maybe I could draw something out here. The light's really beautiful." He nodded without asking more and motioned to a wooden bench nearby. Savannah sat down, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw, pencil moving lightly over the page. Elijah returned to the horse, but he couldn't help noticing the way she bit her lip in concentration, the slight tremble in her fingers whenever she started a new line. There was something about her that made him want to look longer, but he pushed the thought away. She was someone running, someone seeking shelter. He had no right and no courage to want anything more. Still, he couldn't deny that Savannah was changing the farm in quiet, subtle ways. He'd started cooking better meals instead of reheating canned food. He cleaned the porch, weeded the lavender beds, chores he hadn't touched in months. And every evening, when she sat on the porch sketching, he found himself lingering at the doorway, watching her like she was a painting he didn't dare touch. She made him remember what it felt like to care for someone, something he thought he'd buried the day Grace left. "You're really good with horses," Savannah said suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. She was still focused on her sketchbook, but her voice was gentle, like an invitation to talk. Elijah shrugged, stroking the horse's nose. "Just habit. They're easier than people." She let out a soft laugh, small but clear, and he instinctively glanced her way. "I've never been around horses before," she said, looking up. "They seem strong, but gentle too, aren't they?" "They are," he replied, his gaze meeting hers for a beat. "They know how to listen without judgment." His words made her pause. She looked at him as if searching for something in his expression. Then she smiled, a sad, genuine smile. "I think you do too." Elijah didn't know what to say to that. He turned away, pretending to check the reins again, though his heart was beating harder than usual. He wasn't used to words like that. He wasn't used to someone looking at him the way Savannah did, as if she really saw him, not just the solitary man who lived on a quiet farm. Savannah returned to her sketching, but her thoughts wandered. She thought about Elijah, how he moved through his space with a kind of quiet strength, always calm but carrying a sadness she couldn't quite name. She wondered about the woman in the photo, about the clothes that still hung in the guest room closet. She wondered why Elijah lived alone, why he'd opened his home to a stranger like her. But most of all, she thought about how he made her feel safe, not with words but with his presence, with bowls of hot soup and cups of tea left quietly by her side. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, watching as he led the horse through the misty pasture, his tall frame outlined against the morning fog. Something about him made her want to draw, not just his shape, but the loneliness he carried, like an unfinished painting. She turned to a fresh page and began sketching, slow, deliberate strokes filled with emotion. She drew him from behind, broad shoulders, cowboy hat tilted, the horse beside him. It wasn't her most technical work, but it was real, and that made her heart ache in the most unexpected way. Elijah turned back and saw her still drawing. He didn't approach, didn't peek at the sketchbook, but he lingered, as if trying to stretch the moment just a little longer. He thought of Grace, how she once said he wasn't enough to make her stay. He thought of Savannah, how she made him want to open up again, even though he knew how dangerous that could be. He'd already lost once. He wasn't sure he could survive losing again. "You should head inside," he said, voice low. "Morning mist gets cold out here." Savannah looked up and smiled faintly. "Thank you, Elijah, for everything." He nodded, saying nothing, but his eyes were softer than usual. He turned and led the horse back to the stable, but his steps were slower, as if he too wanted to hold on to this morning. A moment when the farm wasn't just his refuge, but the place where two broken hearts had started to find each other. Chapter 5. Horseback rides, sketches, and misty mornings. Morning fog blanketed the fields, laying a sheer white veil over the rows of lavender, as if the whole world had fallen into a quiet dream. Savannah stood beside the stable, a brush in hand, gently grooming Daisy, the brown mare who had grown accustomed to her clumsy but endearing touch. 1 month had passed since she arrived at Turner Farm, and now she moved through the space with a comfort that surprised even her. Grace's old flannel shirt and jeans had become her uniform, her blonde hair tied in a high ponytail, loose strands falling across her cheeks. She was no longer the trembling bride in a New York alley. She was Savannah, a woman learning how to live again. Elijah appeared from the field holding 2 steaming mugs of ginger tea. He set one on the wooden fence, his eyes flicking to her and Daisy, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're getting the hang of this better than I expected," he said, his deep voice laced with gentle teasing. Savannah shot him a playful glare, but couldn't suppress her smile. "Daisy's easier to deal with than you," she replied, jutting her chin. Daisy snorted in apparent agreement, and both of them laughed, the sound blending into the crisp morning air. A month on the farm had changed Savannah. The nightmares of St. Augustine's Church, her mother's scolding, her father's cold eyes, they still came, but now only as shadows, no longer strong enough to choke her. She woke up each day to the scent of wet grass, the soft neighing of horses, and Elijah's quiet presence, the man who had turned this place into her temporary home. She wasn't afraid of the future anymore, even if she didn't know where it would take her. The farm with its lavender fields and horses had given her space to breathe, to heal, and to remember that she once knew how to smile and dream. They cared for the horses together, moving in natural sync. Elijah taught her how to check hooves, how to tie reins without upsetting Daisy. Savannah learned quickly. Her hands, once used only for brushes and paints, now knew how to stroke a horse's mane and feel its breathing. Sometimes when they worked in the stable, their hands would accidentally touch, reaching for the same brush or tugging the same bale of hay. Each time, Savannah felt her face flush and turned away, pretending to be busy. Elijah never said anything, but she noticed he often paused for a second, his eyes flicking toward her before he resumed working. One afternoon, after they weeded the lavender garden, Savannah dragged Elijah to the porch where she had laid out a large sheet of paper and colored pencils. "Today you're drawing," she declared, eyes sparkling with mischief. "No excuses." Elijah raised an eyebrow and sat down with mock reluctance. "You really know how to boss people around," he said, but still picked up a pencil, his rough hand fumbling slightly. She laughed, sitting beside him, showing him how to sketch a horse. "Just a few curves for the body," she said, guiding him step by step. When he drew the wrong line, she laughed and grabbed his hand to correct it, feeling the warmth of his skin. She let go quickly, her cheeks burning, and faked a cough. Elijah looked at her, his eyes twinkling, but said nothing. He just kept drawing, even though his lines were crooked and childlike. "Look, I drew a horse," he said, holding up the paper with mock pride. His horse looked more like a fat cat, making Savannah laugh so hard her stomach hurt. "It's a masterpiece," she said, wiping her tears. "I'm going to hang it in the stable so Daisy can admire it." Elijah gave her a mock glare, but then chuckled, and in that moment, they were like two kids, free and lighthearted. Savannah tossed a pencil at him. He dodged it and retaliated by flicking a few drops of tea at her. She squealed and chased him around the porch, their laughter rising above the wind sweeping the fields. They stopped, breathless, standing closer than they realized, and when their eyes met, both turned away, hearts pounding. But even in those light-hearted moments, Savannah carried private thoughts. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, no matter how much the farm had become a part of her. She thought about the Blake family, her mother's cruel words, Ethan, who never loved her. She wondered if she'd ever be brave enough to face them, or to start a new life where she could paint and be herself again. And she thought about Elijah, how he made her laugh, made her feel safe. She feared she was becoming too attached, that when she finally left, she'd either take his heart with her or leave hers behind. Elijah had thoughts of his own, hidden behind his quiet eyes. He watched Savannah, the way she laughed while brushing Daisy, the way she secretly sketched him when she thought he wasn't looking. She brightened the farm, reminded him of what it felt like to care for someone, something he had buried since Grace left. He remembered Grace, not with pain now, but as a reminder that the people he loved never seemed to stay. He knew Savannah didn't belong here, that she had a bigger life waiting out there, a place where she could shine. But every time she smiled, every time their hands touched, he wanted to keep her just one more day. That evening, they sat on the porch, each holding a mug of ginger tea, watching the fog lift in the golden light. Savannah opened her sketchbook and showed him a drawing she had just finished. A herd of horses galloping across the field, moonlight glinting off their manes. "I drew this morning," she said softly. "I think it feels like freedom." Elijah looked at the drawing, then at her. his gaze deep and unwavering. "You're talented, Savannah. Don't let anyone take that from you." She smiled, but a wave swelled in her chest. She wanted to tell him he was the reason she remembered how to draw, that he made her want to stay, but she only nodded, and they sat there, silent, each lost in their thoughts, yet both feeling the invisible string tightening between them, pulling them closer, even if neither dared to name it. The midday sun spilled across the fields, making the rows of lavender shimmer like a soft purple sea. Savannah knelt by the flower bed, hands covered in soil as she carefully plucked the weeds growing between the lavender stalks. The scent of earth and blooms blended together, offering a sense of peace she had learned to cherish over the past month living at Turner Ranch. She wore an old flannel shirt, her hair tied up high, a few strands falling loose around her cheeks, and the smile on her lips now came more naturally, as if every day here was a step toward reclaiming herself. Elijah was at the stables, tending to the horses alongside Daisy, the brown mare Savannah had grown fond of. From a distance, she could hear him whispering to them, his deep voice comforting, and she smiled, thinking of all the moments they'd shared, morning rides, painting together on the porch, and that moonlit night when he held her hand and told her she made him want to live again. That sentence still echoed inside her, sweet and terrifying, because she hadn't yet dared to name the feeling growing in her heart. The sound of a car on the dirt road broke her train of thought. Savannah looked up to see a sleek black Mercedes stopping at the gate. The door opened, and her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the two figures stepping out, her father Richard Blake in an expensive suit, and her mother Eleanor Blake in a tight-fitting dress and with eyes cold as steel. They stood there against the rustic backdrop of the ranch, like statues lost from another world. Savannah sprang to her feet, hands trembling, dirt clinging to her shirt. She felt herself pulled back to that day at St. Augustine's Church, when her mother had screamed she was a disgrace, and her father had turned away without so much as a glance. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She stood frozen, watching her parents approach, each step like a hammer against the fragile confidence she had slowly rebuilt. "Savannah," her mother said, her voice icy, her eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Look at you, filthy like some housemaid. What do you think you're doing in this wretched place?" Savannah clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. "Mom," she croaked, her voice hoarse, How did you find me?" Her father, Richard, stepped forward, his expression stern but tinged with disappointment. "Did you really think we wouldn't? You ran out on your wedding, turned yourself into a laughingstock among high society, and now you're hiding out here like a failure. Do you have any idea what our family has had to endure?" Each word felt like a blade slicing open old wounds she thought had healed. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat tightened. She remembered all those years trying to please them, giving up her dream of painting, studying business, agreeing to marry Ethan just to protect the family's honor. And it all amounted to humiliation when Ethan never showed up, and her mother called her a disgrace. "I didn't want to be a joke," she finally said, her voice trembling but steady. I just wanted to live." Her mother let out a sharp laugh, as brittle as shattered glass. "Live? You call this living? Covered in mud, shacking up with some farmer, throwing away everything we gave you? You're a Blake, Savannah. It's your duty to restore the family's reputation, not hide here like a coward." Tears threatened to fall, but Savannah bit her lip to hold them back. She looked down at her dirt-stained hands and thought of the paintings she'd made, the laughter she shared with Elijah, the sense of freedom galloping through the fields. This ranch, humble as it was, had given her more than the Blakes ever had, a place to be herself, not a pawn in their power games. Before she could respond, Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping but cutting like a blade. "Listen to me, Savannah. You will return to New York. We found someone else, someone willing to overlook your scandal. You'll marry him, and we'll erase this whole mess. But if you refuse, you'll lose everything. Your inheritance, your trust fund, all of it. You'll have nothing but this filthy ranch. Is that really what you want?" Savannah's breath caught. Her mother's threat hung in the air, like a knife at her throat. The Blake estate was massive, millions in assets, properties, shares. It had been her safety net growing up, a guarantee of comfort. But it came with chains. A life of obedience, of sacrificing dreams. Her heart, her very self. She thought of the paintings hidden in the living room, of Elijah's gentle gaze, of feeling truly alive for the first time in years. Were those things worth more than the fortune her parents were using to control her? She looked at her mother, then her father, their faces hard, unmoving. She began, her voice shaky. I don't want your money. I want my freedom. Eleanor's eyes widened, then narrowed. Freedom? You think this is freedom? Living like a pauper? You'll regret this, Savannah. When you're broke and alone, don't come crawling back. Richard's voice boomed across the field. Enough! You're coming home, Savannah. You've shamed us long enough. You're a Blake, not some farm girl. The weight of their words pressed on her, years of trying to fit into their mold. But then she thought of Elijah, how he stood with her in the field, and said she had nothing to prove to anyone. She thought of the life she was building here, fragile but real. She stood tall, her voice firm despite the tears glistening in her eyes. I'm not going back. I'm not your puppet anymore. I choose myself. Before her parents could reply, Elijah stepped out from the stables, wiping his hands on his jeans. He had heard the shouting, saw Savannah trembling, and the calm in him shifted into something stronger. He stood beside her, not touching but close enough that she felt his strength. Is there a problem? He asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on Richard. Richard sneered. And who are you? The leech feeding off my daughter's stupidity? Elijah Turner, he said without flinching. This is my ranch. Savannah is welcome here as long as she wants. And from what I've heard, she doesn't owe you anything. Eleanor scoffed and turned to Savannah. This is your choice? A nobody over your family? You're throwing away everything. Your name, your future, your fortune. For this? Savannah looked at Elijah, his steady gaze lending her courage. She thought of their late-night talks, their playful mornings, the way he saw her, not as a Blake, but as herself. She turned to her mother, her voice clear. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing life. And if that means losing your money, then so be it. Richard's face turned crimson, but before he could speak, Elijah stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. She doesn't have to prove anything to you. If you can't see her worth, that's your failure, not hers. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Richard glared at Elijah, then back at Savannah, jaw clenched. You're making a mistake, he said. Don't expect us to clean it up when you fall. Eleanor took her husband's hand, voice dripping with disdain. Come, Richard. She's made her choice. She's no longer our daughter. They turned and walked back to the car. The Mercedes roared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Savannah standing in the field, heart pounding but shoulders lighter, as if a chain had been cut loose. She felt Elijah beside her, his presence a quiet anchor. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she smiled, a trembling yet resolute smile. Thank you, she whispered, turning to him, for being here. Elijah looked at her, eyes gentle yet fierce. You don't need to thank me. You're stronger than you think, Savannah. I just wanted you to see that. She took his hand, fingers shaking but sure. His hand was rough and warm, and when he gently squeezed, she felt a quiet reassurance that whatever the future held, she wouldn't face it alone. They stood there in the middle of the lavender field, sunlight on their backs, and though both still carried their fears, they knew this moment, choosing to stand together, was the beginning of something new, even if it didn't have a name yet. Are you still following the story? Please leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below. All your comments are the motivation for us to create better stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much. Dawn peeked over the hills, casting a pale golden glow across the lavender fields, like a soft whisper welcoming a new day. Savannah stood on the porch, a steaming cup of ginger tea in her hand, her eyes drifting across Turner Ranch, the place she had called home for over a month now. The rows of purple swayed gently in the breeze. The brown horses stood quietly in their stalls, and the old wooden house radiated a simple warmth. She wore her familiar flannel shirt, her hair loosely tied, and though her heart still bore scars, it now beat to a new rhythm, gentle yet full of life. The confrontation with her parents a few days ago still lingered in her mind. Her mother's threat that she'd lose her inheritance and everything else if she didn't return to New York blew through her thoughts like a cold wind. But instead of fear, it brought clarity. She didn't need the Blake fortune to be herself. She had chosen the ranch, chosen Elijah, and above all, chosen her own path, even if it was uncertain. That decision, though it cost her a piece of her past, had opened a new door, one where she could paint her life with her own hands. Savannah stepped into the living room, where she had transformed a corner into her art studio. Her paintings were scattered across an old wooden table, lavender fields under moonlight, horses galloping through the mist, the cabin glowing in the sunset. Each painting was a piece of her, a declaration that she was no longer the abandoned bride, no longer the puppet of the Blake family. She picked up a brush, her fingers gliding over an unfinished painting. Elijah's figure from behind, leading a horse through the field, his gaze distant yet tender. She painted him not just because he was part of the ranch, but because he was the one who had shown her she could be strong, that she could be herself. She heard familiar footsteps, and Elijah appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee, his eyes sweeping over her studio corner. "Up early again," he said, his deep voice laced with playful teasing. "Painting already?" Savannah smiled and set the brush down. "I couldn't sleep, too much on my mind." He nodded, stepping inside, his gaze lingering on the painting of himself. He didn't say anything, but the corner of his mouth lifted, and Savannah blushed, quickly pulling another canvas over it. "Don't look," she said, flustered. "It's not finished." Elijah chuckled, his low laugh sending a flutter through her chest. "I'm not complaining," he said, sitting across from her. "You're talented, Savannah. These paintings, they have soul." His compliment made her pause. She looked at him, wanting to tell him that it was because of him, that he had inspired these paintings, that he had helped her rediscover a passion she'd buried long ago. But she only smiled and said quietly, "Thank you. I'm just trying to find myself again." He looked at her, his eyes deep in understanding, as if he could hear everything she wasn't saying. "You're doing better than you think," he said. In that moment, in the small room filled with the scent of paint and old wood, Savannah felt an invisible thread connect them. Not through words, but through the way he always showed up, quietly standing beside her. And she knew, though her heart leaned toward him, they were still keeping a distance. Not because they didn't want to be close, but because they both carried wounds that hadn't fully healed, fears they hadn't yet faced. After breakfast, Savannah decided to turn her studio into a real workspace. With Elijah's help, she cleared out a corner of the room, brought in an old easel they'd found in the shed, and hung her favorite paintings on the wall. Elijah brought in a small wooden table and set it by the window so she'd have natural light while painting. They worked side by side, laughing when Savannah accidentally spilled paint on his shirt, and when he playfully flicked some back at her, splattering it on her cheek. They stood there laughing, and for a moment his hand brushed her cheek to wipe the paint away. Their eyes met, and both quickly turned away, hearts pounding. That afternoon, Savannah sat on the porch, her sketchbook on her lap, drawing every corner of the ranch. The wooden roof, the lavender rose, Elijah's silhouette as he worked in the stables. She couldn't stop drawing, as if every stroke of the pencil helped her capture this place, this chapter of her life that made her feel more alive than ever before. She thought of the paintings she started the night Elijah held her hand in the field, the ones she titled "The Man Who Held Me in the Alley." It wasn't just about him, it was about the moment she realized she wasn't alone, that someone was willing to stand beside her, even as the world fell apart. She made the bold decision to submit that painting to a local art magazine, something she never thought she'd have the courage to do. She carefully wrapped the canvas and wrote a short letter introducing herself. Not as Savannah Blake, daughter of the wealthy elite, but as Savannah, an artist searching for her place in the world. Elijah stood beside her at the town post office, pride in his eyes even though he said nothing. "I did it," she whispered as they stepped outside, her voice trembling. "I never thought I would." Elijah smiled, his gaze soft. "I never doubted you." A few weeks later, a letter from the magazine arrived. Savannah opened it with shaking hands and screamed when she read the words, "The man who held me in the alley" had been selected for publication in their next issue, along with a short feature on her, a new artist living among Vermont's fields, drawing inspiration from simplicity and human connection. She ran to the stables where Elijah was working and threw her arms around him, not caring about the dirt on his shirt. "Elijah, they picked my painting," she cried, tears shining in her eyes. "They want to publish it." He hugged her back, laughing, his arms strong yet gentle. "I knew you could do it," he said, voice low and warm. "You're an artist, Savannah, a real one." She looked at him, heart racing, wanting to tell him that he was the reason she dared to try, that he was the man in the painting, but she only smiled and let him pull her into another hug. And in that embrace, she no longer felt like a disgrace, no longer the abandoned bride. She was Savannah, the girl painting her own life, one brushstroke at a time. That night, they sat on the porch under the moonlight, gazing at the fields. Savannah rested her head on Elijah's shoulder, sketchbook in her lap, though she wasn't drawing. She just wanted to be there, with him, feeling his warmth and the peace of the ranch. She thought about the future, the paintings she would create, the days ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She had lost her fortune, her family, and the road ahead was uncertain. But with Elijah by her side, she knew she had the courage to keep going. Elijah looked at her, eyes deep and thoughtful, and he thought about Grace, how she had left, leaving behind an emptiness in him. But Savannah wasn't Grace. She was here, with a radiant smile and soulful art that made him believe in new beginnings. He didn't say a word, only gently squeezed her hand, and they sat there beneath the moonlight, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together, one step at a time. The Vermont sky that night was crystal clear, with a full moon hanging bright and heavy above, casting a silvery glow over the lavender fields. The campfire crackled in the middle of the meadow, orange flames dancing and throwing warm light across Savannah and Elijah's faces. They sat side by side on an old wool blanket, close enough to feel each other's warmth, yet with a small gap between them, as if both were afraid that touching might shatter something fragile. Around them, the sound of crickets blended with the whisper of wind through the flowers, forming a soft, intimate melody of nature. Savannah hugged her knees, eyes flickering over the fire, occasionally settling on Elijah's face, the sharp lines, the faint stubble on his chin, and those deep brown eyes reflecting the flame. She wore her familiar flannel shirt, her golden hair loose and gently stirred by the breeze. A month and a half on the ranch had changed her, not just in appearance, with sun-kissed skin and calloused hands from pulling weeds and grooming horses, but in spirit. She was no longer the trembling girl in a New York alleyway, mascara running and heart shattered. She was Savannah, someone who had rediscovered her smile, her passion for painting, and a sense of belonging she'd never known before. Elijah sat beside her, one hand braced on the blanket, the other absent-mindedly stirring the fire with a stick. He was silent, as usual, but his silence was never empty. It was full of thoughts, of emotions he hadn't yet dared to speak. He watched Savannah, the way she tilted her head to admire the moon, the quiet smile she gave when a spark leapt into the sky. She had brought life back to the ranch, made him remember what it felt like to believe in love, before Grace had left and taken part of his heart with her. They'd planned this campfire night days ago, after Savannah's painting, The Man Who Held Me in the Alley, was selected by the art magazine. It was meant as a celebration, but more than that, it was a moment to pause, to acknowledge the growing connection between them, even if neither had dared to name it. Savannah brought homemade toasted bread, and Elijah prepared the wood and a flask of ginger tea. They'd laughed while building the fire, teasing when Savannah dropped a log, and when Elijah joked she should paint the fire instead of setting the whole field ablaze. But now, as the night deepened, the air grew still, and both felt a sweet tension settle over them, as if this night was meant for truths long held back. Savannah drew a deep breath, her eyes still on the flames, her voice soft and trembling. yet sincere. "You know," she began, fingers laced tightly in her lap, "I used to think love was just obligation, like a contract, something I had to fulfill to make others happy. With Ethan, with my family, I always felt like I had to earn love, that I had to be enough to be loved, but it only made me feel suffocated." She paused, turning to look at him, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. Elijah turned too, eyes locked on hers. He didn't speak, but the intensity of his gaze gave her the courage to go on. "But with you, I can breathe," she whispered. "You never asked me to be anyone else. You just let me be me. And I never knew love could feel like that until I came here." Her words rippled through Elijah like a stone cast into still water. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with something warm and powerful, something he'd buried ever since Grace left. He set the stick down, his hand trembling slightly, and looked straight into her eyes. "Savannah," he said, his voice deep and raw with emotion, "I buried my heart when Grace left. I thought if I never let myself love again, I'd never have to lose anything again. But then you came, and I could feel my heart beating again." He reached out, his rough fingers gently tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. The touch was soft, but enough to make Savannah's heart pound. She looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the truth in every word he'd said. "You make me want to live again," he continued, his voice raspy. "You make me believe that maybe there is another chance, a new beginning." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled, a trembling, radiant smile. She leaned in closer, shrinking the distance between them, and before she could think too much, she placed her hand on his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. "Elijah," she whispered, voice choked with emotion, "I'm scared, but I want to be here. With you." He looked at her, his gaze steady and full of depth. And then, as if there was no holding back anymore, he leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss started gently, like a question. But when she responded, it deepened, full of longing, of all the feelings they'd both tried to bury. Savannah felt the heat of him, the scent of wood smoke and dry grass, and her heart melted into the firelight and moonshine. The kiss wasn't just a moment, it was a confession that they had found each other through scars and fears, and they were ready to take a chance. They pulled apart, their breaths mingling, their eyes still locked. Savannah rested her forehead against his, laughing softly through her tears. "I never thought I could feel this way," she said, her voice trembling. "Like, I've found home." Elijah wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, strong and gentle. "You are home, Savannah," he murmured. "Wherever you are, I want to be there with you." They sat in silence by the fire under the moonlight. Savannah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She thought of her journey, from the broken bride in a wedding dress to the woman now sitting here, free and alive. She thought of Elijah, of how he had given her a place to heal, a place to love. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in this moment, she knew she had found something precious, someone who made her feel enough, just by being herself. Elijah held her tighter, breathing in sync with her. He thought of Grace, not with pain now, but with release. Savannah wasn't Grace. She was light he never expected to find, and though part of him feared she might leave one day, he wanted to hold on to this moment, to believe that love could last, like the lavender that bloomed again, season after season. They sat there by the fire, with the moon and flames bearing witness to their confession and their kiss. And in the quiet that followed, they both knew, whatever lay ahead, they would walk through it together, step by step, day by day. A year had passed since the night Savannah fled St. Augustine's church, heartbroken, barefoot, and bleeding. Turner Ranch was now a living portrait of healing and love. Lavender bloomed in radiant rose, stretching like a sea of violet under the Vermont summer sun, and the old wooden house breathed the warmth of a true home. Savannah had become an irreplaceable part of this place, not just through her paintings, but through her laughter, the way she cared for the horses and how she lit up Elijah's world. She stood by the stables, gently brushing Daisy's mane, a bright smile on her lips. Her blonde hair was loosely tied, a few strands dancing in the breeze, and her flannel shirt was speckled with paint from her little studio. A year ago, she never could have imagined herself here, living freely, no longer shackled by the Blake name or the label of the abandoned bride. She had lost her inheritance, left behind New York's glamorous world, but she had found herself and found Elijah, the man who gave her a place to begin again. Elijah stood at the edge of the lavender field, eyes never leaving Savannah. He wore a deep red flannel shirt, a cowboy hat tilted slightly, and his heart pounded with the weight of what he was about to do. Over the past year, he had watched Savannah bloom like the fields around them, from a trembling girl in an alley to a passionate artist, a strong, radiant woman. She had made him believe in love again, though he once thought his heart had died when Grace walked away. That night by the fire, their confession, their kiss, had opened a new chapter. And now he wanted to continue that story, not with words, but with a promise. He took a deep breath, clutching the small box in his pocket. The silver ring inside, engraved with a delicate paintbrush, was a gift he had been planning for weeks, crafted with the help of a local jeweler. It wasn't flashy like the jewels of New York, but it held their meaning, of Savannah, who had painted her life anew, and of him who found light in her. "Savannah," he called, his voice low but warm as he stepped toward her. She turned, her eyes sparkling when she saw him. "Where have you been hiding all morning?" she teased, brushing Daisy's nose before stepping out of the stable. "I thought you'd left me for the horses." Elijah chuckled softly, but his gaze was more serious than usual. "Come with me for a bit," he said, holding out his hand. "There's something I want to show you." She raised a brow, curious, but took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his rough palm. They walked through the fields, past blooming lavender, the sweet scent surrounding them. Savannah thought he might be taking her to a new corner of the ranch or to show her a new painting. But when they stopped under an old oak tree, she saw something different in his eyes, an anxious kind of joy. Elijah dropped to one knee, and Savannah's heart stopped. He pulled the small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a silver ring that shimmered in the sun. "Savannah," he began, voice deep but trembling, "I'm not good with fancy words. I don't know how to start over after everything that's happened. But if I have you, then everything feels like the first time." She covered her mouth, tears brimming, not from sadness, but from overwhelming joy, as if her heart couldn't hold it all. Elijah looked at her, his eyes full of love. "You made me believe in love again," he continued. "You are my home, Savannah. I want to spend my life beside you, painting the days ahead. Will you marry me?" Savannah burst into tears, but her smile was brighter than the sun. She nodded, voice shaking. "Yes, Elijah. Yes, I'll marry you." She knelt in front of him, and before he could slip on the ring, she threw her arms around him, tears soaking his shirt. Elijah held her tightly, laughing, a joyful sound she rarely heard from him. Gently pulling back, he slid the ring onto her finger. When she saw the paintbrush engraved in it, she laughed through her tears. How did you know to choose this?" she asked, voice trembling. "Because you're my artist," he said, brushing her cheek. "And I want you to always remember that." They stood embracing in the middle of the lavender field, sunlight glinting through the oak branches, making the ring on her hand sparkle. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and thought about their journey, from that hug in the alley, to the campfire night, to this very moment. She had lost one world but found another, a world where she was loved and free to be herself. And Elijah, who once buried his heart, now stood ready to begin again, with her. Months later, the small Vermont town buzzed with excitement for a special event. Savannah's art exhibition, titled "Where Lavender Blooms and Love Begins Again." The gallery, a renovated barn, was packed with people, locals, artists from nearby towns, and even a few critics from New York. Her paintings lined the walls, each telling a story. Lavender under moonlight, horses through morning mist, the cabin at sunset, and at the center, the man who held me in the alley, the painting that had introduced her to the world. Savannah stood in the middle of the room, wearing a simple white dress, not a wedding gown, but it made her look like a bride nonetheless, a bride of her own life. The silver ring sparkled on her hand, and beside her stood Elijah, tall in a flannel shirt, pride shining in his eyes as he watched her greet guests. She spoke of her inspiration, the ranch, her journey back to herself, but didn't mention the Blakes or Ethan. They were the past, and she had left them behind. A critic, an older woman with gold-rimmed glasses, stopped in front of Elijah's portrait. "Young lady," she said, "this painting isn't just beautiful. It has soul. This man, who is he?" Savannah smiled, glancing at Elijah standing a few steps away. "He's my home," she replied, her voice soft but sure. The exhibition ended with applause, praise, and invitations from galleries. But for Savannah, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when she and Elijah left the gallery hand in hand and walked out into the moonlit lavender fields. They paused, looked at each other, and she leaned into him, savoring his warmth in the cool night air. "I did it, Elijah," she whispered, "and I couldn't have done it without you." He kissed her forehead, his eyes shining. "We did it, Savannah. Together." They stood there surrounded by lavender, the moon lighting the path ahead, and in that moment they knew, no matter what life brought next, they had found each other. A home not made of walls but of hearts, a love that had begun again and would forever bloom.